There are nights when even the brightest stars feel heavy, and even the loudest voices grow quiet. This is one of those nights. A night when Rick, the man who always had an answer, found himself changed forever. And before I begin, I want you to know something. We truly love and care for you. You are safe here. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's step gently into the story. There are nights when the quiet feels heavier than usual, when the air itself carries something unspoken, lingering like a sigh that doesn't quite fade. Rick's garage had always been a place of noise, tools clinking, glass shattering, sparks fizzing against metal. But tonight, there was only a gentle hum, a rhythm so low it sounded less like machines and more like breathing. A breathing not his own. Rick sat hunched over his workbench, goggles pressed against his forehead, a screwdriver dangling loosely in his hand. The fluorescent light flickered above him, but he hardly noticed. He had built so many things here, some brilliant, some disastrous, many forgotten, yet the machines tonight seemed to whisper back at him, as if reminding him that they were more than parts and wires. He frowned, then chuckled bitterly under his breath. Machines don't whisper, people do, and people always want something. But still the hum stayed. Not sharp, not loud, just different, like a lullaby made of electricity. On the shelves, jars of odd liquids glowed faintly, casting the faintest hue across the walls, green, blue, amber. The shadows bent strangely, and for the first time in a long while Rick didn't feel like the master of this room. He felt like a guest. He leaned back in his chair, the legs creaking, and rubbed his temples. Maybe it was the late hour. Maybe it was the drink. Or maybe it was something else, something waiting in the air, patient and unseen. Rick closed his eyes just for a second, but in that second, he swore he could hear it. A voice that wasn't a voice, a sound that wasn't exactly sound, a whisper. Too soft to catch the words, yet familiar enough to feel like it was spoken only for him. The hum deepened. He opened his eyes. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt altered. His inventions, stacked high and dusty, seemed less like forgotten projects and more like silent witnesses. He looked at them and realized uncomfortably how many of them he couldn't even remember making. For a moment, he didn't reach for another tool. He didn't try to fix or build or tear apart. Instead, he just sat there listening. His fingers tapped against the workbench in an unsteady rhythm, matching the pulse of the humming. The garage smelled faintly of metal and burnt circuits, but beneath it, softer, was a trace of something else. Like the smell of rain before it begins, sharp but alive. He couldn't remember the last time he'd thought of rain without associating it with some kind of interdimensional disaster. Yet now the thought was strangely gentle. Rick tilted his head back, staring at the ceiling. The bulb flickered again, dimming. And for just an instant, he thought he saw stars through the cracked wood above him. Stars, faint and unblinking, like they had bent themselves closer to peek inside his garage. He blinked, and the ceiling was just the ceiling again. Rick sighed. Great. Now I'm hallucinating constellations in my own damn house. But something inside him didn't dismiss it. Something inside him held onto it quietly. The hum faded, softening into the silence of night. The only sound left was the faint tick of a clock on the far wall, though even that seemed uncertain, as though unsure if it wanted to keep time tonight. Rick stood stretching his back, joints cracking, and walked slowly toward it. The clock hands twitched faintly, almost nervous, then steadied. He stared at them longer than he meant to, longer than was rational. Something about the way the clock stuttered felt like a reflection of himself, the brilliant, broken, stubbornly still moving. He reached up to adjust it, fingers brushing against cool glass, and for an instant the whisper returned, softer this time, like breath on the back of his neck. His hand froze. Rick didn't turn. He didn't move. He just whispered back, almost mockingly, almost pleadingly, "What do you want?" The silence after stretched so long it felt like an answer of its own. Finally, Rick lowered his hand, stepping back. His eyes lingered on the clock a little longer before he returned to his chair. The screwdriver was still waiting there, but he didn't touch it. He sat, he listened. Outside, the world slept. In the distance, faint traffic hummed like a lullaby of ordinary lives. In the garage, Rick, a man who had seen galaxies burn, who had outrun time itself, felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not even sorrow, Something quieter. Something almost tender. He leaned forward again, resting his chin on his hand. The machines, the shelves, the clock, they all seemed to be holding their breath as if they were waiting for him to say something first. But Rick, for once, didn't fill the silence with words. Instead, he let the silence fill him, and in that silence the whisper returned, so faint it could have been his own thoughts echoing back. A reminder that something was coming. Something old, something patient. Something that had always been waiting in the hum of his machines. Rick swallowed, throat dry, and exhaled slowly. His eyes drifted shut again, and the hum carried him not into sleep, but into something gentler. Something like remembering. And somewhere in that remembering the first cracks in his armor began to show. The night stretched on. The whisper lingered. The machines kept humming, like a song meant only for him. The clock on the far wall had always been there, or at least Rick thought it had. A cheap round thing with faded numbers and a second hand that clicked like a nervous tap dancer. He had never paid much attention to it before. Time, after all, was something Rick bent, broke, or outran at will. But tonight it was different. The hum in the garage had quieted, but the clock's hesitant tick carried through the silence, each sound louder than it should have been. Tick, tick, tick. Then suddenly, nothing. The second hand froze between numbers. Suspended, as if deciding whether to move forward or retreat. Rick narrowed his eyes. Huh? That's new? He stood, wobbling slightly, the faint warmth of drink still swimming in his veins, and crossed to the clock. The glass cover was dusty, the frame scratched. A thing of no importance, yet now in this hushed night it looked less like an object and more like a portal. Like the kind of door you don't notice until you've already stepped halfway through. Rick lifted the clock gently from the wall. It was lighter than he expected, fragile even, as if time itself were thinner here. The hands inside shivered faintly, then stilled completely. Broken junk, he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the back. No batteries, no mechanism, just a hollow shell. His chest tightened. He remembered it now. Not the whole story. Rick rarely allowed himself the full reel of memory, but a flicker. A flash of something buried. A garage, not this one, smaller, messier. A clock handed to him by someone whose face had grown blurred in the haze of years. A gift, or maybe just a passing kindness. He couldn't place it. He shook his head. Nope, not doing this. Not tonight. But the silence pressed him. And the whisper, that strange breath he had heard earlier, seemed to curl from inside the clock itself, low and beckoning. He couldn't make out words, but he could feel their weight. Old words. Words that tasted of dust and forgotten years. Rick carried the clock back to his bench and set it down carefully, almost reverently. His hands lingered on it longer than he meant to, tracing the scratches along its edges. For a man who had touched countless alien devices, artifacts of civilizations older than Earth itself, this was nothing. And yet it was everything. He sighed and leaned back, eyes closing for a moment. And then it happened. Not a dream, not a hallucination. Something in between. When his eyes opened, the garage wasn't the same. The tools were gone, replaced by toys scattered across a floor. The shelves were lower, lined not with chemicals and jars, but with storybooks, crayons, and things small hands would reach for. The air smelled different, too, cleaner, warmer. Rick blinked, and for a fleeting moment he wasn't the man hunched in a garage. He was a boy, small and uncertain, standing in a room he half remembered. On a table the same clock sat, its hands unmoving as if it had been waiting all this time. And in the doorway, someone. A figure he couldn't fully see. Tall, familiar, blurred at the edges. Like memory itself was shielding their face. They spoke, but he didn't hear words. Only the tone, gentle, patient. The kind of voice that holds you steady before the world teaches you how sharp it can be. Rick reached out, wanting to catch the words, wanting to fix them in his mind. But the figure faded, the toys dissolved, and the garage returned. The clock was still there, silent. Rick exhaled shakily, running a hand down his face. He hated moments like this, moments where the past slipped through the cracks, reminding him that before he was the smartest man in the multiverse, before the drinks and the mistakes, before the endless machines, he had been something else. Someone else, and maybe, he thought bitterly, he had lost that person long before he built his first portal gun. The clock remained silent on the bench, but he couldn't look away. "Why now?" he whispered. His own voice sounded strange, too soft, too human. "Why show up now?" The silence gave no answer. Rick reached for a rag, wiped dust from the glass, and set the clock upright. Its hands still hadn't moved. The brokenness of it nagged at him, not because he cared about fixing clocks. He had long stopped caring about fixing anything, but because it mirrored something deeper. A frozen second, a moment stuck between moving forward and falling back. A moment he had never left. He tapped the glass once, lightly. Nothing. Again, still nothing. And then, faintly, the second hand quivered. Not forward, not backward, just a tremor, like a heartbeat beneath thin skin. Rick leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. The hum in the garage shifted. Quieter now, but steadier, almost like a reassurance. The whisper didn't come back, not in sound, but in presence. And Rick, for the first time in longer than he could remember, didn't feel entirely alone. The clock didn't tick again that night, but in its silence it carried him somewhere else, somewhere he hadn't gone in years. He slumped back into his chair, eyes heavy, the broken watch still gleaming faintly under the dim light. And though he didn't admit it to himself, though he'd never say it aloud, he was afraid to close his eyes because he knew what he might dream of next. The past. The boy he once was, and the choice he never understood. The garage held him in its quiet. The machines hummed softly. The stars beyond the ceiling waited, and the clock, still broken, watched him too. Morty had never been good at sleeping through nights when Rick worked late. The sound carried through the walls, tools clicking, sparks buzzing, an occasional muttered curse or laugh that didn't sound like joy. Most kids his age would have buried their head under a pillow and forgotten about it. But Morty wasn't most kids. He rolled over in his bed, the glow of the clock on his nightstand whispering 2:17 a.m. The house was quiet otherwise. His mum asleep down the hall, his dad snoring faintly, Summer lost in her own world of dreams. Only Rick's garage hummed on, like a restless mind refusing to rest. Morty sighed, staring at the ceiling. Something felt off tonight. Not wrong exactly, but heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, he slipped out of bed, padded softly across the carpet, and crept to the garage door. He found Rick, sitting not in motion, but in stillness. That was the first thing Morty noticed, because it was rare. Rick wasn't tinkering or soldering or flipping switches. He was just staring. The dim light above cast long shadows across his face, and his eyes were turned upward, fixed on something Morty couldn't see. Morty hesitated. His grandfather looked different like this, smaller somehow, softer, almost fragile. He didn't want to break the spell, but his own worry tugged at him. Rick?" Morty's voice cracked softly through the stillness. Rick blinked, slow, like someone pulled back from far away. He turned his head, and though his smirk came out of habit, it didn't reach his eyes. "What are you doing up, Morty? Shouldn't you be drooling on your pillow right now?" Morty shuffled closer, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I couldn't sleep. I heard you out here, but you're not working. You're just staring." Rick leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking back toward the ceiling, though the roof kept the stars hidden. "Sometimes even geniuses gotta stare, Morty. Builds character." Morty frowned, unsettled. Rick's words usually carried a spark, sharp or sarcastic, even when he was insulting someone. But tonight his tone was different. Dull, like a match struck but refusing to catch fire. He stepped closer and caught sight of the clock on the bench, its hands frozen in place, dust wiped clean from its glass. Rick's gaze wasn't only on the ceiling, it had been locked on that too. "Is that a clock?" Morty asked, puzzled. Rick waved his hand lazily. "Just a busted toy. Means nothing." But Morty didn't believe that. He'd grown used to reading the small cracks in Rick's armor, the way his mouth twitched when something mattered, the way his eyes lingered too long. Tonight, Rick was cracked all over. Morty sat down on a stool near the bench, swinging his legs nervously. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Normally, Morty would fill it with rambling questions, desperate to keep up with Rick's rhythm. But this time he stayed quiet. He didn't know why. Maybe because the quiet felt important. Rick finally broke it. His voice was low, almost to himself. "You ever feel, Morty, like the universe knows something you don't? Like it's keeping a secret from you, right in plain sight? Morty swallowed. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I feel like that. But you usually, do know everything. So, if you're asking, that's kind of scary. Rick chuckled softly, but it faded quickly. Yes, scary, that's one word for it. They sat there together, Morty shifting uncomfortably at first, then settling. The minutes passed. Rick's hand rested on the broken clock, absent-mindedly tracing its edges. Morty's eyes followed, his worry deepening with each small motion. Finally, Morty said, "Rick, you're not okay, are you?" Rick glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "What makes you say that, Morty?" "I'm great. Never better. Got machines humming, stars spinning, galaxies waiting for me to tear 'em apart. That sound like a guy who's not okay?" But Morty shook his head. His voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "You don't look like that guy. You look tired, like you're waiting for something. For someone." Rick's smirk faltered. His eyes flicked back to the clock, then to the invisible sky above them. "Maybe I am, Morty. Maybe I've been waiting a long time." The words hung heavy between them, and Morty didn't push further. He knew better. Sometimes Rick built walls out of words, and pushing only made them taller. Tonight, sitting in silence felt better, so Morty stayed. He didn't talk, didn't move much, just sat there, keeping Rick company. And in a strange way, it was enough. Rick glanced at him once more, eyes softer than usual. "You know, Morty, for a kid, you're not half bad at just being here." Morty smiled faintly, a warmth spreading in his chest. "Yeah, well, I guess someone's got to keep an eye on you, Rick." Rick huffed a quiet laugh, though sadness lingered at its edges. "Guess so, Morty, guess so." The garage hummed on, soft and steady. The broken clock stood silent between them, and above, though they couldn't see it, the stars stretched wide and endless, watching, waiting, listening. Morty didn't understand what Rick was holding inside, not fully. But he understood something more important. Rick wasn't invincible. He was human, and tonight he needed someone to notice. So Morty stayed, and Rick for once didn't ask him to leave. Rick rarely dreamed. Or at least, that's what he told himself. His mind was usually too full, too tangled in equations and half-finished blueprints, to allow space for anything so simple as a dream. Sleep for him was shallow, restless, cluttered with noise. But that night, after Morty's quiet company, something unusual happened. When Rick's head finally sank against the couch cushion in the corner of the garage, the world slipped away without its usual fight. His body loosened, his breath evened out, and then, like a whisper sliding under a locked door, a dream crept in. It began with light, not harsh fluorescent light like the lab, but soft golden light, the kind that comes from a childhood summer afternoon. Rick blinked against it, confused. He was small again, his legs shorter, his hands unscarred by years of work. Around him stretched a backyard he hadn't seen in decades, the grass taller than his knees, the air sweet with the smell of lilacs. He looked down and saw it, a toy rocket, half-painted, resting on the ground. He remembered this. He had built it when he was only a boy, long before equations filled his notebooks, long before cynicism painted his thoughts. The rocket wasn't special. It couldn't fly. But to young Rick it was everything, a symbol of possibility, of wonder. A voice called his name. High, cheerful, familiar. He turned and saw her, a friend from that long-ago childhood. She had always been there, always laughing with him, running beside him. He couldn't recall her face in waking life anymore, but here it was clear, framed by sunlight. "Are you going to launch it?" she asked, pointing at the rocket. Rick hesitated, picking it up. In the dream it felt heavy, heavier than it should. I don't know," he admitted, his young voice trembling. She tilted her head, smiling with the innocence only children carry. "But you made it. Doesn't that mean it's ready?" Rick stared at the toy in his hands, torn. Even here, even in a dream, he felt the weight of choice pressing against him. The rocket was supposed to fly. But deep down he knew it wouldn't, and the disappointment, hers, his own, seemed unbearable. "I think it's broken," he muttered, eyes dropping. The girl stepped closer, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "Maybe. But sometimes things don't have to work to mean something." Rick swallowed hard, the words piercing deeper than he wanted them to. His chest ached. He didn't understand then, not fully, but the ache told him the truth mattered. The dream shifted. The backyard blurred, dissolving into stars. Rick was older again, but not the man he was now. Somewhere in between. A teenager, standing on a hill beneath a sky too large for his shoulders. The rocket lay forgotten in the grass behind him. The girl was gone. He was alone, and the stars seemed to whisper. Not words exactly, but a sound like breath, calling him, pulling him forward. Rick clenched his fists. He remembered this moment too. A choice he'd made, perhaps the first real one. He had chosen the stars, chosen brilliance, chosen the endless chase of answers. And in doing so, he had left behind something softer, something that asked nothing of him but presence. He couldn't even remember her name. That realization stung most of all. The stars brightened, blurring until they were almost unbearable. And then darkness. Rick gasped awake. His body jerked, his chest tight, his hands gripping the couch cushion as though holding on for dear life. Sweat lined his brow. The garage was quiet, only the faint hum of machines filling the air. For a long moment he sat there, breathing hard, staring at the floor. His eyes drifted toward the bench where the broken clock sat, unmoving. Its silence mocked him. A reminder of the hours lost, the memories faded. He rubbed his eyes, muttering under his breath. Dreams, just dreams. Don't mean a damn thing, but he knew they did. He felt it in the ache of his chest, in the way his hands shook just slightly. Dreams carried truths he had long buried, and tonight one had clawed its way back to the surface. Morty stirred from his seat nearby, having dozed off while keeping watch. He blinked groggily, rubbing his face. "Rick, you okay?" Rick glanced at him, the instinct to deflect rising quick. He almost said something sharp, something dismissive, but the weight of the dream pressed too heavily. He only sighed, leaning back. "Yeah, Morty," he said softly, though the lie trembled in his voice. "Just a dream." "Go back to sleep." Morty nodded, trusting him. Within moments he was drifting again, his head lolling gently to the side. Rick sat in silence, staring at the broken clock once more. His mind replayed the girl's words, as clear as if she'd spoken them a second ago. Sometimes things don't have to work to mean something. He closed his eyes. And for once, instead of running from the thought, he let it linger. The garage was quiet. The machines hummed low. And Rick, the man who never stopped moving, sat still, listening to echoes of a younger self. There are sounds a man grows used to, the hum of machines, the faint crackle of wires, the soft click of tools against metal. For Rick, those were the lullabies of his nights. They kept his mind busy, kept his hands moving, kept silence at bay. But that night, as he sat alone in the garage after Morty had gone to bed, another sound crept in. At first he thought it was nothing more than the whir of an old fan, the kind of noise you barely notice until you're already tired. But as the minutes stretched, the sound began to shape itself into something more. A rhythm, a presence. And then words. He froze. His hand hovered above the table, the broken clock lying motionless before him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and shook his head. "Great, now I'm hearing things. Wonderful." But the voice returned, low, steady, threaded with something not entirely human. "You've forgotten," Rick chuckled dryly, reaching for his flask. "Forgotten? Buddy, that list's too long for one night." He took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in his chest. "You'll have to be more specific." The garage seemed to breathe, shadows shifting against the walls. The voice carried no anger, no urgency, just calm like the way waves roll against the shore. "You left something behind." Rick's hand tightened around the flask. His jaw clenched. "Yeah, I've left a lot behind. That's the price of have all this." He gestured at the cluttered lab around him, wires coiling like vines, half-finished machines waiting in silence. But even as he spoke, a shiver crept down his spine, because deep down he knew the voice wasn't wrong. He set the flask down, hard enough to rattle the tools on the bench. "All right," he muttered. "If this is some interdimensional prank, cut it out. I've had enough of cryptic nonsense for one lifetime." The clock on the table glowed faintly, just a pulse, soft and rhythmic, as though it had remembered how to beat. Rick leaned forward, his breath catching. "That's not possible." But the voice only whispered again, "Not everything needs to be possible, Rick. Some things only need to be remembered." His throat tightened. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak. The words settled into him like a seed in soil, quiet, unshakable. He hated it. Hated the way it made him feel small, the way it dragged him back to corners of his past he had long sealed shut. He closed his eyes, resting his head in his hands. And in the stillness, he heard it again, not the strange voice, but another one, buried deep in memory. Laughter. Light. The sound of someone who had once believed in him before the universe grew so unbearably loud. When he finally lifted his head, the glow had faded. The garage was once again its old self, silent, mechanical, unfeeling. The clock sat motionless, its hands frozen as before. Rick pushed back from the table, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He muttered under his breath, more to himself than to any phantom voice. Yeah, well, remembering never fixed anything, and yet he didn't walk away. He sat there long after, staring at the still clock, his fingers drumming slowly against the table. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for him to listen. The night stretched on, patient, heavy with quiet, and for once Rick didn't fill it with noise. He simply sat, the hum of machines fading into the background, and let the silence press gently against him. Morty wasn't usually awake this late. His nights were supposed to be filled with restless dreams, tossing and turning after the chaos of whatever adventure Rick had dragged him into. But tonight was different. Something in the house felt too still. He padded softly down the hallway, the floor creaking under his bare feet. The glow from under the garage door caught his eye. It wasn't unusual. Rick lived in that garage more than in the house, but the silence that spilled from beneath it was. Rick's garage was never silent. Morty pushed the door open a crack. There was Rick, slouched at the workbench, staring at something Morty couldn't see. No tools clattered, no muttering under his breath, no spark of invention. Just Rick motionless, like a statue in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Rick. Morty's voice was soft, cautious. Rick didn't look up. He just tapped his finger against the table, slow and steady. Morty stepped closer, unsure if he was intruding. Normally Rick would bark at him, tease him, tell him to go back to bed. But tonight he only sighed. Morty hesitated, then pulled over a chair. He sat beside him, legs swinging just short of the ground. The silence pressed around them, heavy and strange, but not uncomfortable. Morty realized he didn't need to speak. Rick didn't need questions right now. He needed someone to simply be there. For a while they just sat. The machines hummed faintly, the dim lamp above casting a warm halo that softened Rick's sharp edges. Morty glanced at his grandfather, studying the way his eyes seemed distant far beyond the room. There was a weariness there, a loneliness Morty couldn't quite name. He thought about all the times Rick had yelled at him, pushed him, thrown him into danger without a second thought. But here, in this quiet moment, Morty saw something else, a man who carried too much. Someone who was used to being alone with his thoughts, even when those thoughts hurt. You know, Rick, Morty whispered, almost afraid to break the quiet. It's okay to just sit sometimes. You don't have to fix everything. Rick chuckled, but there was no humor in it. That's the thing, Morty. If I don't fix it, nobody will. Morty frowned, but he didn't argue. He just leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Well, maybe you don't gotta fix it tonight. Maybe tonight you just sit here, and I'll sit here too. Rick glanced at him, then really looked at him. For once, Morty's eyes weren't filled with fear or confusion, just steady presence. It reminded Rick of something he couldn't quite place, like the way someone long ago had once sat with him in silence. When words weren't enough, he didn't respond. He didn't need to. Morty understood that sometimes love didn't sound like big speeches or heroic promises. Sometimes it sounded like nothing at all. Just breathing side by side, just letting another person know they weren't alone in the dark. The clock on the table flickered faintly, a glow Morty didn't notice, but Rick did. He glanced at it, then back at Morty, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel the urge to hide behind sarcasm. He just sat there, letting the silence become their shared language. Minutes stretched into an hour. Morty's eyelids grew heavy, his head nodding forward until it rested lightly on the table. His quiet breaths filled the room, soft and steady. Rick looked at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Kid, you don't even know what you're doing for me. But Morty didn't need to know. He had given Rick something rare, stillness without judgment, company without demands. And for a man who lived his life in noise, chaos, and unending motion, it was the most valuable gift of all. Rick leaned back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of Morty's sleep. The voice he had heard earlier lingered in his mind, whispering of things forgotten, of things left behind. But for now he didn't chase it. For now he let Morty's presence anchor him, keep him from drifting too far into the weight of his thoughts. And somewhere in the quiet, Rick realized that maybe not everything had to be solved. Maybe some things just needed to be shared. The garage had always been a labyrinth of noise and brilliance, wires tangled like veins, tools scattered like constellations. But on this night, after Morty had quietly returned to bed, Rick lingered in the silence. He sat for a long time, staring at the shadows that stretched across the concrete floor, until something tugged at him, an old itch, a pull from the past. His eyes drifted to the farthest corner of the garage, the one cloaked in dust and cobwebs. Even Rick, with his chaotic genius, rarely touched that space. It was where the abandoned projects slept. Inventions left unfinished, too tender or too painful to revisit. With a heavy sigh he stood, his lab coat brushing against the clutter as he moved. His boots crunched faintly on forgotten bolts and glass shards. And there it was, a small crate, rust creeping over the edges, the wood splintered from time. Rick knelt slowly, his knees creaking, and ran his hand across the surface. The lock gave easily, as though it had been waiting for him. Inside was a machine, no bigger than a suitcase, its surface dulled with years of neglect. Its shape was strange, curved edges, soft lines, not the harsh, efficient design Rick usually favored. This was different, almost gentle. He brushed the dust away, revealing faint engravings along its side. Symbols he recognized not from science but from something far more human. Beth's doodles, the childish scrawls of a little girl, etched in permanent marker. A flower, a star. The shaky outline of a hand. Rick froze. His throat tightened, and for once no clever words came. He remembered now, this wasn't just a machine. This was the dream of a father. Long ago, in one of the rare moments when Beth had sat beside him in the garage, Rick had tried to build something not for the multiverse, not for escape, but for her. A device meant to capture dreams, not in data or numbers, but in images, in soft recordings that could be replayed like lullabies. He had wanted to show her that the world could be beautiful, even when he didn't know how to say it out loud. But the machine had never worked. He'd abandoned it when life grew heavier, when science became a weapon instead of a gift. And now here it was, staring back at him like a ghost. Rick lowered himself to the floor and rested his hand on the cool metal. For a moment he let his head hang. The hum of the garage felt softer now, as if it too was remembering. He muttered, "Stupid thing," but his voice cracked. He opened the panel and peered inside. The wires were brittle, the circuits corroded, but the design was unmistakably his. He could see the care he had put into it, the way his hands had moved slower, gentler, when Beth had been there watching. He closed his eyes and a memory surfaced. Beth, no more than 7, tugging at his sleeve. "Daddy, can you make me something that keeps the dreams from going away?" she had asked. He had laughed then, not unkindly. "Dreams fade, kid. That's the way it goes." But she'd looked up at him with those wide, hopeful eyes, and he'd sighed. "All right, fine. I'll try." Rick swallowed hard. The memory lingered like a ghost, sitting in the dust beside him. He didn't try to fix the machine. He didn't even reach for a tool. He just sat with it, letting the weight of what it meant wash over him. Somewhere behind him, the floor creaked. Morty's small voice broke the quiet. "Rick, you're still up?" Rick didn't turn around. "Yeah, Morty, just cleaning up some old junk." Morty stepped closer, curious. "What is it?" Rick hesitated. He wanted to deflect, to throw some sarcastic jab. But when he glanced at Morty, he saw the same eyes Beth once had. The eyes that believed in him even when he didn't deserve it. So instead, he said softly, "It's something I made a long time ago. For your mom." Morty blinked. He wasn't used to Rick talking about Beth like this. "Did it work?" Rick gave a hollow laugh. "Nah, nothing I make ever really works the way it should." Morty frowned. He sat down beside Rick, brushing dust from the floor with his sleeve. "But you tried, right? That's kind of what matters." Rick stared at him, the corners of his mouth twitching. He wanted to argue, to insist that results were all that counted. But he couldn't, not tonight. For a long while they sat there together, staring at the broken machine. Morty's presence was steady, grounding. Rick let his fingers trace the etched flower Beth had drawn, and for once he didn't feel the urge to erase the past. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe some inventions aren't meant to work. Maybe they're just meant to—" "Remind you." Morty tilted his head. "Remind you of what?" Rick closed the crate gently, his hand lingering on the lid. "That I wasn't always this." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was almost peaceful. Rick stood brushing off his hands and Morty followed. Neither of them spoke as they left the garage. But something had shifted between them, and in the quiet corner of the garage, the forgotten invention remained, still broken, still unfinished, but no longer unseen. There had always been a rhythm to Rick's life, a relentless, unbroken thrum of movement. Machines sparking, portals opening, words spilling faster than breath. But after finding the forgotten invention, something inside him softened, as though a missing note had returned to an old song. The next morning was unusually quiet. No explosions, no frantic scribbling, no half-barked orders at Morty to fetch this or hold that. Instead, Rick sat outside on the porch, an old mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He wasn't tinkering. He wasn't muttering formulas under his breath. He was just sitting. Morty shuffled out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The sight was strange enough to make him stop in his tracks. Rick, still and silent, watching the sky as though it had secrets worth waiting for. Rick?" Morty asked hesitantly. Rick didn't turn. "What is it, Morty?" Morty blinked. "You're not working on anything?" Rick finally glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Ever think maybe there's more to life than blowing holes in the universe?" Morty stammered, caught off guard. "Well, I mean, I guess. But you don't usually—" He trailed off, sitting gingerly beside Rick. For a while they didn't speak. The morning air carried a faint chill, and the quiet hum of cicadas filled the spaces where Rick's machines usually whirred. Morty glanced at him nervously, waiting for some punchline, some wild plan. But instead Rick closed his eyes and let the silence hold him. Morty fidgeted. "So, what are we doing?" Rick smirked faintly. "We're practicing stillness, Morty. Ever heard of it?" Morty frowned. "Like meditation?" Rick shrugged. "Call it whatever you want. Point is, you sit, you breathe. You let the universe do the talking for once." Morty opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped. He noticed the way Rick's shoulders, usually tense, knotted with invisible weights, were relaxed. His breathing was steady. For the first time, Rick didn't look like a man trying to outrun himself. Morty hesitated, then mimicked him. He sat back, closed his eyes, and tried to be still. At first his thoughts raced. He wondered what time it was, whether he'd done his homework, whether Rick would suddenly declare this all a waste of time. But slowly something shifted. The air pressed gently against his skin. The sounds of the world grew clearer, the rustle of leaves, the creak of wood beneath their feet, the faint rhythm of Rick's breath beside him. It wasn't boring. It was calming. Rick spoke softly, his voice carrying none of its usual bite. "You spend your whole life thinking you've got to keep moving, keep building, keep proving something. But sometimes, Morty, the smartest thing you can do is stop." Morty peeked an eye open. Rick's face was softer now, touched by the pale morning light. He looked almost peaceful. Rick added, "Chaos is easy. Stillness? That's the real trick." The words settled between them like warm embers. Morty thought about the countless adventures they'd been on, the running, the fear, the noise, and now here they were, sitting quietly, as if this too were an adventure of its own kind. After a long silence, Morty whispered, "I don't think I've ever seen you like this before." Rick chuckled, a low, weary sound. "Don't get used to it, but sometimes, Morty, even I need to remember I'm not just a machine in a lab coat." Morty nodded, though he wasn't sure Rick saw it. He closed his eyes again, letting the quiet stretch on. For once, he didn't feel like he had to fill it. The sun climbed slowly, painting the sky with soft streaks of gold. The world felt slower here, as though it too respected the fragile stillness they'd carved out. Rick finally set his mug down and stood, stretching. "All right, Morty, lesson's over." Morty blinked. "That was it?" Rick shrugged. "That's the point. You sit, you breathe, you learn. No explosions, no paradoxes, just being." Morty thought about it as they stepped back inside. It felt simple, maybe too simple, but he realized something. Rick hadn't just taught him about stillness. He had shown him. And sometimes that meant more than any portal or machine ever could. That night, as Morty lay in bed, he replayed the moment in his mind. The quiet porch, the slow breaths, Rick's uncharacteristically gentle words. He found himself breathing the same way, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. And before he knew it, sleep came easily, as if stillness itself had followed him into his dreams. Rick sat in his garage that evening, surrounded by the faint glow of forgotten machines, but his hands did not move. Tools lay scattered across the bench, wires coiled like sleeping snakes, and yet he made no effort to fix or finish anything. The lesson in stillness lingered with him, but it also stirred something he hadn't expected: memories. He pressed his palms against his eyes, sighing as though to hold back the weight of it, but it came anyway. Not with noise or chaos, but with a quiet gentleness he could not resist. It was Beth, not the grown woman she had become, not the strong voice that both challenged and mirrored his own, but the little girl she once was, small hands, wide eyes, a laugh that rang like a bell Rick hadn't heard in decades. He remembered her running barefoot across the grass in the backyard, her curls bouncing, a stuffed horse dangling from her tiny fist. She had looked up at him as though he were the center of every possible universe. And then there was that memory, the one he never spoke of, the one he tucked away like an unfinished equation. She had been no older than 5, maybe 6. The day had been long and messy. Wires everywhere, experiments gone wrong, a younger Rick drowning in his own impatience. He had been hunched over some project that he now couldn't even remember, cursing under his breath, lost in the fever of invention. And then Beth appeared at his side, holding out her hand. "Daddy," she had said simply. No demands, no questions. Just a child's quiet request to be acknowledged. Rick remembered how small her hand was, how hesitant, how for a brief moment he considered brushing her off. But then, for reasons he still couldn't explain, he reached out and took it, and in that instant everything stilled. Her hand was warm, trusting, and utterly unafraid. She didn't know the chaos inside him, the brilliance that cut like a blade, the walls he was already building around himself. She only knew him as her father, the man she believed would keep her safe. Rick closed his eyes now, sitting in the dim glow of the garage. He could still feel it, the tiny weight of her fingers wrapped around his, a tether he hadn't deserved, but one he had clung to without realizing how much it mattered. Morty peeked in, hesitant. "Rick, you okay?" Rick cleared his throat quickly, reaching for a screwdriver just to look busy. Yeah, Morty, I'm fine." "Why wouldn't I be fine?" Morty stepped closer, frowning. "You just look different, like quieter." "You're not usually like that." Rick smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't get used to it, kid." But Morty sat down on a stool nearby, watching him. He didn't press, didn't pry. And in that silence, Rick realized something strange. Morty's presence reminded him of Beth's hand. That same quiet trust, that same unspoken understanding, Rick muttered almost to himself. "She used to look at me like you do, Morty. Like I was more than I am." Morty tilted his head. "Beth?" Rick didn't answer directly, but Morty understood. The night stretched on, filled with the faint hum of machines that would never matter as much as that one memory. Rick sat in it, letting the image of Beth as a child soften the sharp edges of his mind. For once, he didn't feel the need to drown it in alcohol or bury it under equations. Instead, he allowed himself to remember the softness of her voice, the way her hand had fit into his, the way for a fleeting moment he had been enough. Later, when Morty had gone to bed, Rick lingered in the garage, staring at his hands. They were older now, scarred, stained with years of work and regret. But he still remembered the day they had held something fragile and pure, something he hadn't managed to keep, but had never truly lost. He whispered into the empty room, almost as if Beth were still small enough to hear him. "I remember, kid. I remember." And with that he leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy, heart heavier, and let the silence cradle him to sleep. The portal did not open with its usual sharp crackle. Tonight, when Rick lifted the device and pressed the button, it bloomed like a soft ripple in water. Its glow was muted, more like moonlight than neon, spilling into the garage with a gentleness Morty hadn't seen before. "Come on, Morty," Rick said quietly, his voice missing its usual edge. "We're not going somewhere loud this time." Morty hesitated. Okay, Rick. Where are we even going?" Rick didn't answer with words, only stepped through. Morty followed. On the other side, there was no chaos, no explosions, no bizarre creatures rushing at them. Instead, they stepped into a world painted in twilight. The air shimmered with a soft blue haze, and the sky stretched endlessly above, filled with stars that moved so slowly they seemed half asleep. The ground beneath them was covered in grass that glowed faintly, not harsh like neon, but calm, like fireflies resting on the earth. A stream ran nearby, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the stars so perfectly that Morty felt as if he were standing between two skies. Time itself felt slower. Each breath lingered. Each step echoed gently, as though the world insisted they move without hurry. Morty rubbed his arms, shivering slightly. "Whoa, Rick, this place feels weird, like everything's waiting." Rick looked around, his eyes softer than usual. "It's not waiting, Morty, it's resting." The two of them walked along the stream. Their footsteps pressed lightly into the glowing grass, which sprang back the moment they lifted their shoes, leaving no mark. The silence was deep but not empty. It was full of a quiet music, the kind you feel in your bones more than hear with your ears. Morty tried to speak again, but Rick shook his head gently. "Shh, just listen." So Morty did, and in the stillness, he noticed things he'd never have noticed otherwise. The faint hum of the water flowing, the way the stars seemed to breathe in rhythm with the stream, the soft warmth of Rick walking beside him without rushing ahead. For the first time, Morty realized he wasn't afraid. Not of Rick, not of the world, not of what might come next. He felt safe. They came upon a tree, ancient and massive, its branches wide enough to hold half the sky. Rick sat down at its roots, leaning back against the bark. Morty hesitated, then sat down too, a little closer than usual. "Rick," Morty whispered after a long silence, "why'd you bring me here?" Rick didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where two moons rose slowly, one silver, one pale gold. Finally he said, "Sometimes, Morty, the smartest thing you can do is nothing. Just sit. Just let time hold you." Morty frowned. "But you're always busy, Rick. You're always building stuff or running from something. You never just..." "Sit?" Rick smirked faintly, but it was tired, softened. "Yeah, well, maybe that's the problem." The silence stretched again, but it wasn't heavy. It was comforting. Morty leaned his head back against the tree, listening to the quiet rhythm of the world. His eyelids grew heavy, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Rick glanced at him and for once didn't wake him or push him to stay alert. Instead, he let the boy rest. As Morty drifted off, Rick stayed awake a little longer, watching the moons rise higher. He thought of Beth's small hand in his, of Morty's quiet trust now, of the weight he carried and the rare moments when it lifted. The universe was vast, chaotic and merciless, but here, in this still corner of it, Rick felt something rare, gentleness. And when he finally closed his eyes, leaning back against the ancient tree, he allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe gentleness was enough. The stream kept flowing, the stars kept breathing, and the world held them both in silence. The next morning, or what passed for morning in that timeless dimension, Morty woke to the sound of water. Not rushing, not loud, just a steady stream that seemed to whisper. He rubbed his eyes and found Rick already awake, crouched near the water's edge. The stream was wider here, its surface so calm that Morty gasped. It didn't ripple, didn't break. It mirrored the sky with such perfect clarity that he felt dizzy, as though he were staring into another universe. Above, stars still glowed faintly in the pale dawn, and below the same stars shimmered back at him. It was like standing between two infinities. "Rick..." Morty's voice was hushed, almost reverent. "Say it's like glass." Rick nodded slowly, not looking away. "Yeah, Morty. That's why they call this place the River of Glass. Every universe has got spots like this. Places that don't make sense, don't follow the rules. Places that remind you the cosmos isn't just noise." Morty knelt beside him, peering into the reflection. He expected to see only his own face, but the longer he looked, the more the reflection shifted. He saw himself younger, holding toys he barely remembered. He saw his mom smiling in the kitchen. He saw Rick, not grinning wildly but standing still, his eyes softer. "Rick," Morty whispered, "it's showing me stuff like memories." Rick finally glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Not memories." "Not exactly. More like the universe showing you the parts you forgot you needed." Morty shivered. "That's That's kinda scary. Rick shook his head. No, Morty, that's comfort. Scary is thinking you're alone in all this. Comfort is knowing the universe is bigger than your pain. The water shimmered as if agreeing. Morty touched it gently, expecting the reflection to shatter, but instead his fingers only deepened the glow. The stars beneath his skin pulsed softly, then smoothed back into stillness when he pulled away. Rick watched him closely. You don't always need answers, Morty. Sometimes you just need to sit by the water. They sat together in silence. Birds, or something like them, drifted overhead, glowing faintly like lanterns. The air was cool but carried a softness that wrapped around them like a blanket. Morty thought about all the times Rick had dragged him through chaos, screaming aliens, collapsing planets, endless danger. And here they were now, just quiet. He realized something then, something he couldn't quite put into words. Rick wasn't just showing him a strange place. He was showing him a piece of himself he didn't usually let anyone see. After a long while, Rick spoke again, his voice unusually steady. You know, Morty, when I was younger, I didn't stop much. Didn't think about anything but building and running and proving I was smarter than everyone else. But this place... He trailed off, gazing into the glassy water. This place reminds me there's more than... All that noise, Morty looked at him carefully. Do you ever regret it, like not stopping sooner? Rick chuckled, low and rough, but it wasn't mocking. Regret's just another way of holding on to stuff you can't change. What matters is if you learn to sit by the river once in a while. Morty didn't know what to say, so he didn't. He leaned against Rick's arm instead, tentatively, waiting to see if his grandfather would push him away. Rick didn't move. The moons climbed higher in the mirrored sky, casting long beams of light across the water. For a moment, the reflections above and below aligned perfectly, so that it looked as if Rick and Morty were sitting at the center of the universe. Balanced between two endless skies, Rick sighed softly, closing his eyes. You see, Morty, this is what they don't tell you about the multiverse. It's not just chaos. It's also this quiet, gentle, endless, and it'll keep going whether you're watching or not. Morty rested his head against Rick's shoulder, and this time he didn't feel the weight of fear or confusion. He felt steady like the glass river itself. For once, Rick didn't rush to leave, didn't pull out a gadget, didn't crack a joke. He just sat there, letting the stillness hold him, and together they breathed with the stars. The night after the river, Rick and Morty camped under a sky that felt too wide to belong to any single world. The stars pulsed softly, like lanterns swaying in some unseen breeze. Morty lay back on the ground, his arms folded behind his head, while Rick tinkered with a small half-broken gadget that sparked faintly in his hands. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence wasn't heavy, just present, the kind that hummed like background music you didn't realize you'd been listening to all along. Morty felt his eyelids grow heavy, but his mind wandered, restless with thoughts. Finally, he broke the quiet. Rick? Rick didn't look up. You ever think about what makes you laugh? Like, not the usual stuff. Not when you're making fun of someone or when you're being all, mean funny. I mean really laugh, like the kind that sneaks up on you. Rick paused mid-turn of his screwdriver. His eyes narrowed slightly, but then he smirked. Morty, the multiverse isn't exactly overflowing with good comedy. You either laugh at it or you drown in it. Morty frowned. That's not what I meant. He sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. I mean, when's the last time you laughed because something was just pure? Rick didn't answer right away. He just stared at the gadget, then set it down beside him. He reached for his flask, but halfway through lifting it, he let his hand fall again. His eyes were on the stars, but his mind was somewhere else. It's been a while, he said finally. Morty swallowed, unsure what to say. He didn't want the moment to close up like it usually did, when Rick brushed things aside. So instead, he tried something different. He picked up a stick from the ground and, with a grin, balanced it across his upper lip like a silly mustache. He turned toward Rick, eyes crossed, his best attempt at an exaggerated, goofy face. For a heartbeat, Rick didn't react. Then, against Morty's expectations, a sound broke out, low at first, almost like a cough, but then it grew, rich and rough, spilling out of Rick's chest in uneven bursts. Rick was laughing, really laughing. It wasn't sharp or cruel, not his usual biting chuckle. It was unguarded, almost boyish, the kind of laugh that slipped out before he could stop it. Morty blinked, stunned, then laughed too, partly at his own ridiculousness, partly because Rick's laughter was contagious in a way he had never heard before. The two of them sat there laughing into the night. Morty's face hurt from smiling, and Rick's shoulders shook as he pressed a hand against his eyes, trying to catch his breath. But then, as the laughter faded, Rick's expression changed. The smile lingered on his lips, but his eyes, those sharp, brilliant eyes, dimmed. It was as though the joy had stirred up something buried, something heavier, Morty noticed. "What's wrong?" Rick didn't answer right away. He reached down, picked up the gadget again, and turned it in his hands. His fingers moved, but his mind wasn't in the motion. "That laugh, Morty. It reminded me of something, someone." His voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "Back when I was, well, before all this. Before the choices, before the running. There was a time when I laughed like that more often." Morty tilted his head. "With who?" Rick gave a small, wistful huff. "Doesn't matter. Point is, it didn't last. Nothing ever does. You laugh, you feel alive for a second, and then reality catches up." Morty frowned, his chest tightening. He didn't know how to argue with Rick's kind of sadness, the kind that seemed older than him, older than the both of them combined. But he tried anyway. "Yeah, but just because it doesn't last forever doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Right? Like, we just laughed, Rick, and it felt real. Even if it fades, we had it." Rick's eyes flicked to Morty. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he let out a sigh, not the irritated kind, but one that sounded like a door opening. Just a little. "Yeah, Morty, you're right." His voice was quiet, almost tender. "We had it." The night stretched on. The stars above blinked softly, mirrored by the faint glow of their campfire. Rick leaned back, resting against the earth, his flask untouched at his side. Morty lay down again too, this time closer, so their shoulders brushed. They didn't need to talk anymore. The laughter still lingered between them, not loud now, but present like an echo. And though Rick's smile carried its usual sadness, Morty could see it. Beneath the weight, beneath the years, Rick was still capable of joy, still capable of being human. For Morty, that was enough. And for Rick, though he'd never admit it, that was everything. The next morning was slow, softened by the quiet hum of a distant breeze that stirred the grass around their camp. Rick hadn't touched his flask all night, and Morty noticed. He didn't point it out, though. Sometimes silence spoke better than words. Rick stood by the edge of a low hill looking out at the horizon. The sky here didn't change much. Always twilight, always painted in violet hues that felt like dusk stretched into eternity. Morty shuffled up beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're up early," Morty murmured. Rick gave a dry chuckle. "Didn't really sleep." His voice was flat, but not cold. There was a tenderness beneath it, like a note played quietly on a piano. Morty hesitated, then asked, "You were thinking about last night? About what you said?" Rick didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, as though he could see something far beyond it. "There was someone once," he said finally. "Someone who understood me. Before I even understood myself, a friend. Maybe the only real one I ever had." Morty blinked, surprised. Rick rarely spoke of his past, and almost never of people in it. "What happened?" Rick tilted his head back, exhaling slowly. "We were kids. He was different. Not brilliant in the way I was, but sharp in his own way. Kind. The kind of person who could sit in silence with you for hours and somehow make it feel like the most important conversation in the world." Morty listened, his chest tight with curiosity. Rick's tone was softer than usual, almost reverent. "We'd build little things together," Rick continued, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Not multiverse-spanning gadgets or weapons. Just silly stuff. A kite that never came down. A clock that chimed only when you wanted it to. Small inventions that didn't mean anything. Except they did. They meant everything back then." Morty could almost see it. A younger Rick. Hair not yet silvered. Eyes brighter. Building alongside someone who didn't measure worth in genius or grandeur, but in moments. "Why'd you stop being friends?" Morty asked softly. Rick's smile faded. He looked down at the ground, his voice quieting. "Because I kept running. Because I always had to be faster, smarter, further ahead. And he stayed. He chose roots." I chose escape. That's the difference, Morty frowned. Do you miss him? Rick didn't move. For a long while, Morty thought he wouldn't answer. But then Rick's jaw tensed and he whispered, "Every damn day." The words hung in the air like smoke, fragile and heavy all at once. Morty shifted uncomfortably, not from judgment but from the weight of what Rick had shared. He wanted to say something, but nothing seemed right, so instead he picked up a small stone and tossed it gently into the distance. It landed with a soft thud, breaking the silence without shattering it. Rick glanced at him, then let out a low laugh. Quiet, tired, but real. "You're learning, Morty. Sometimes saying nothing's the best thing you can do." They sat down together on the hill, watching the horizon as though it might reveal some answer neither of them could find in words. After a while, Morty asked, "Do you think he's still out there?" "Your friend?" Rick leaned back on his hands, his eyes tracing the endless sky. "Maybe, maybe not. But somewhere in the universe, in some timeline. Yeah, I like to think he's still waiting, still building kites that never fall." Morty smiled faintly. "If he's out there. Maybe he's waiting for you, Rick. Maybe it's not too late." Rick didn't reply. His face was unreadable, caught between hope and resignation. But Morty noticed something in his expression, a softness, a quiet ache that almost looked like longing. For the rest of the day, they didn't speak of it again. But as night fell and the stars shimmered above, Rick lay awake, staring upward. His mind wandered back to the sound of his friend's laugh, the way it used to fill the air like sunlight through open windows. And though Rick would never admit it aloud, part of him wished, just for a moment, that time could fold back on itself, that he could return, not as the man he'd become, but as the boy who once believed a kite could stay in the sky forever. The thought stayed with him as his eyes finally closed, a companion who had waited, and perhaps still waited somewhere in the endless quiet of the universe. The morning began with the hush of dew resting on blades of grass. Rick rose earlier than usual, not with his usual restless energy, but with a kind of slow, deliberate quiet. Morty blinked awake, still groggy, and found Rick already fiddling with a small makeshift kettle over the campfire. "You're making tea?" Morty asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. Rick grunted. "Not tea. Just boiled leaves from this place. Might keep you from whining all day." But Morty saw through it. There was no flask in Rick's hand, no belch punctuating his words. His movements were careful, almost tender. Something was shifting inside him, small but noticeable. They walked into a nearby village later that day, a place tucked into the folds of the quiet dimension they had stumbled upon. It wasn't like the bustling cities Morty had seen in other universes. Here the houses were simple, shaped like rounded stones with smoke rising gently from their chimneys. Children played with wooden hoops. Old men sat on porches, eyes half closed in peace. The people didn't seem surprised to see Rick and Morty. They greeted them with nods, as though strangers were just another ripple in the flow of their calm lives. Rick's eyes scanned the village, not with suspicion, but with an unfamiliar stillness. He noticed a woman struggling with a bundle of firewood, her arms trembling under the weight. Without a word, he walked over and lifted it from her hands. "Oh," she gasped softly, startled. "Thank you," Rick shrugged. "Gravity doesn't need to win every time." Morty blinked. He expected Rick to crack a joke, demand some kind of reward, or at least make a snide remark. But Rick simply set the wood down by her door and moved on. No flourish, no ego. Throughout the day, Rick repeated these small gestures. He fixed a squeaky wheel on a child's cart with nothing more than a tightened bolt. He helped mend a broken lantern using scraps from his pocket. He even sat down beside an elderly man who was staring off at the fields and said nothing at all, just kept him company for a while. Morty watched in quiet awe. This wasn't the Rick he knew, the Rick who thrived on chaos, who tore through worlds with reckless genius. This was a Rick who blended into the rhythm of the village, letting himself become part of something soft, something ordinary. That night, as they rested beneath the stars, Morty couldn't hold his question in any longer. "Rick, why are you doing all this? You don't usually, help people." Rick lay on his back, arms folded behind his head. The firelight flickered over his face, softening the lines of weariness. "Because no one here asked me to. They're not expecting me to fix their lives, Morty. Just their cartwheels. Just their lanterns. Small things. And sometimes that's enough. Morty frowned, trying to process it. But don't you always say small stuff doesn't matter? That only the big smart stuff counts? Rick's lips curled into a half smile, but it was tinged with sadness. That's what I used to think. That being the smartest man in the universe meant only big moves mattered. But you spend enough nights in silence, Morty, and you realize small kindnesses stick. They echo longer than you'd think. Morty's chest tightened at the weight of Rick's words. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back beside his grandfather, eyes tracing the endless twilight sky. They sat there for a long time, the silence comfortable. The village behind them glowed softly with the lights Rick had helped repair. The air smelled of earth and smoke, familiar grounding. Rick exhaled slowly, his voice low, almost to himself. Maybe that's what brilliance should have been. Not tearing holes in the universe, just holding it together where it breaks. Morty turned his head, watching Rick with new eyes. In that moment, he didn't see the reckless scientist or the broken man. He saw someone fragile, someone learning, someone quietly changing. And though Morty didn't say it aloud, he felt something stir inside him. Pride, love, and the realization that Rick's journey wasn't about conquering the cosmos. It was about rediscovering the gentleness he had buried beneath layers of armor and regret. That night, as Morty drifted into sleep, he thought about the lantern Rick had fixed, glowing steadily in the dark. A small kindness, yes, but it carried the weight of something much larger. Hope. The village had grown quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, filled with the soft breath of children sleeping, the creak of shutters in the breeze, and the hush of leaves moving against one another. Morty sat outside their small lodging, hugging his knees, staring at the glow of the repaired lantern Rick had left behind. Its steady flame swayed like a heartbeat. Rick was inside, lying on the simple bed they'd been offered. Morty could hear him shifting sometimes, muttering faintly, then sighing like the weight of the stars was pressed against his chest. Morty's mind drifted back through the day. He thought of Rick's hands, usually shaking with impatience, tightening a bolt on a child's toy. He thought of Rick standing silently beside the old man, saying nothing but somehow saying everything. He thought of the absence of a flask, the absence of manic laughter, the absence of sharp words. Rick had been different, softer, and Morty didn't know whether that scared him or comforted him. He rose quietly and went back inside. The room smelled of old wood and clay. Rick lay on his side, back to Morty, shoulders rising and falling in slow rhythm. His hair was messy, his coat folded clumsily at the foot of the bed. "Rick?" Morty whispered. No response. He stepped closer, hesitant, and sat on the edge of the other bed. The lamp between them gave off a faint orange glow, casting shadows across Rick's face. For the first time, Morty noticed how tired Rick looked. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind of tired that lives deep in your bones. Morty swallowed, words gathering in his throat. "You're not invincible, are you?" Rick stirred slightly, opening one eye halfway. His gaze was heavy but not sharp. "Took you this long to figure that out?" Morty felt his cheeks warm. "I mean, you always act like you are. Like nothing can touch you. But today..." He hesitated, fumbling. "Today you were just normal, helping people, sitting quiet. You looked, I don't know, human." Rick turned onto his back, staring at the ceiling beams above. His voice came low, almost tender. "That's the cruelest compliment I've had in years," Morty frowned. "Hate's not meant to be cruel. Hate's just... I forget sometimes. You're my grandpa, but you're also, you know, this big genius universe-traveling guy. I forget you get tired. I forget you need people." The silence stretched between them, warm and uncomfortable all at once. Rick finally sighed. "Morty, I spent a lifetime pretending I didn't need anyone. I thought being untouchable made me strong. Turns out it just made me lonely." Morty's chest ached. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would fix it, but the words tangled inside him. Instead, he whispered, "I don't think you're lonely right now." Rick's lips twitched into the faintest smile. He closed his eyes again, voice dropping to a murmur. "Don't push it, Morty." But Morty could see it. The soft edges of Rick's exhaustion, the small cracks in his armor, the fragile humanity beneath all the science and sarcasm. And for the first time, Morty didn't feel like he was following a superhero. He felt like he was standing beside a man, his grandfather, who needed him just as much as he needed him back. Morty lay back on his own bed, watching the lantern glow until his eyelids grew heavy. He thought about how strange it felt, realizing Rick wasn't made of unbreakable steel but of flesh, bone, memory, and regret. And as Morty drifted into sleep, he made a quiet promise to himself, to be there when Rick couldn't be strong, to listen when Rick fell silent, and to remind him that even the brightest minds deserved to rest. The morning came softly, wrapped in grey light and the cool hush of air before sunrise. Rick was already awake, sitting at the wooden table of their lodging, his head bent over a small box he had pulled from the depths of his coat pocket. Morty stirred on the bed, rubbing his eyes, noticing the strange stillness in the way Rick's shoulders hunched forward. "Rick?" Morty asked, voice still heavy with sleep. Rick didn't answer right away. His hand hovered over the box as though it carried something too delicate to be opened, too dangerous to be left closed. Finally he muttered, "Haven't seen this thing in years." Morty sat up, curiosity pulling him closer. The box was simple, dented metal, the kind that seemed ordinary until you realized Rick never carried anything without reason. With a soft click, Rick opened it, and inside lay a folded note, edges yellowed with age. Morty tilted his head. "What is it?" Rick stared at the note, his expression unreadable, somewhere between defiance and hesitation. "A letter I never read," he whispered. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Morty leaned in, lowering his voice as if not to disturb the moment. "From who?" Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers trembled just slightly as he picked it up. "Doesn't matter. What matters is, I didn't open it. Not then." He turned the paper over in his hands, as though the weight of regret was heavier than the words it contained. Morty stayed quiet, sensing that silence was safer than pressing. Rick sighed, leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I thought I was above it all, Morty. Love letters, apologies, final words. I thought, why bother? Science had more answers than a piece of paper ever could. But," his voice cracked faintly, "turns out answers aren't the same as comfort." Slowly, carefully, Rick unfolded the letter. The paper creaked, fragile, but the handwriting across it was alive, curved, human, imperfect. His eyes scanned the lines, his lips parting ever so slightly as the words slipped into him. Words from another time, another heart. Morty watched him, waiting, but Rick didn't read the letter out loud. His throat worked as though swallowing stones. Minutes passed in silence before Morty whispered, "What does it say?" Rick set the letter down gently, almost reverently. His eyes looked far away, like he was staring into a place only he could see. "It says what I was too scared to hear. That I was loved. That I was forgiven. That someone believed in me even when I didn't." Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to ask who, but he knew it didn't matter. The ache in Rick's voice told him everything, that the name was less important than the feeling it carried. Rick rubbed his face with both hands, muttering, "I wasted so much time, Morty. Thought I had all the universes in the palm of my hand. And I couldn't make room for one piece of paper." Morty reached across the table, his small hand resting awkwardly near Rick's. "Maybe it's not too late to let it mean something now." Rick looked at him, eyes glassy but sharp. "You think reading words decades too late changes anything?" Morty hesitated, then said softly, "It changes you." "That's enough." The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was soft, almost tender, wrapping around them like a blanket. Rick folded the letter again, sliding it carefully back into the box. He didn't lock it this time. He left it open, resting on the table as though it had finally found its place. Later, when the morning stretched into quiet daylight, Rick slipped the box back into his coat. But Morty noticed something new, a faint calmness in his eyes, fragile yet undeniable. The unread letter had finally been read, and though it couldn't rewrite the past, it had given Rick something he didn't think he deserved, a moment of peace, and as they stepped outside into the waking world, Morty thought that maybe love, even delayed, still had the power to heal. The sky that night was a strange shade of violet, stretched thin across the horizon like an old tired blanket. Rick and Morty had stopped on a hill outside of town, their footsteps heavy, their words few. Rick carried nothing in his hands, but Morty could tell he was weighed down by something far heavier than his inventions. They sat in silence for a while, the grass whispering around them, the stars shyly appearing. Morty wanted to speak, but sensed Rick wasn't ready. The old man's eyes were locked on the horizon, unblinking, as though staring into a memory he couldn't escape. "Morty," Rick finally murmured, his voice rough, quiet. "Do you know what brilliance really costs?" Morty blinked, unsure how to answer. No? I mean, I guess it costs time, or like, effort?" Rick gave a dry chuckle, humorless. "It costs people, Morty. It costs connections, warmth, the little stupid moments everyone else gets to have. Every invention I ever made, every portal, every gadget, was a crown I put on my own head. And every crown gets heavier." He tilted his head back, eyes glistening under the stars. "I wore them all, Morty. The crowns of genius, of arrogance, of pretending I was untouchable. And each one left marks I can't erase." Morty's heart ached. He wanted to tell Rick that he was still here, that he wasn't alone. But the weight in Rick's words was ancient, too deep for simple comfort. Rick pressed his palm to his forehead, as though the memory itself was physical pain. "I thought being the smartest meant I could undo anything. If I broke something, I'd build another. If I lost someone, I'd invent my way around the grief. But you can't outsmart regret, Morty. It sits on you heavier than any crown." The wind shifted gently, brushing their faces. Morty thought of all the times Rick had seemed invincible, all the times he had laughed at danger, mocked the universe, and still come out alive. Seeing him like this, fragile, admitting weight he couldn't throw off, was something Morty never imagined. "Rick," Morty said softly, "do you regret everything?" Rick didn't answer right away. His jaw worked, his breath uneven. Finally, he whispered, "Not everything, but enough. Enough to keep me awake when the bottle runs dry. Enough to make every laugh sound hollow." Morty reached down, plucking a small wildflower from the grass. He held it out to Rick awkwardly, unsure if the gesture made sense. "Maybe crowns don't have to be heavy," he said quietly. "Maybe some of them can just be light. Like this?" Rick stared at the flower for a long time before taking it in his rough, trembling hand. He didn't put it on his head, didn't joke, didn't deflect. He just held it, staring at the fragile petals with a softness Morty rarely saw. For the first time that night, Rick's voice gentled. "You know, Morty, no invention I ever built was this delicate, and no invention I ever built lasted this long." The words carried layers Morty couldn't fully understand, but he felt them all the same. They sat together under the wide, violet sky. The flower rested between Rick's fingers like a crown he could actually bear. Maybe regret couldn't be erased. Maybe it would always sit there, heavy and sharp. But in that moment, with Morty at his side and the universe strangely quiet, Rick found something softer than regret, a brief reminder that not all crowns hurt. The stars above shimmered faintly, almost as if bowing, and Morty wondered if the universe itself had been waiting for Rick to finally put one heavy crown down. The night stretched endlessly, as if the stars themselves had forgotten how to fade. Rick and Morty walked side by side through the quiet hills, the air cool, the world unusually hushed. Morty carried a small lantern he had found in the garage, a simple thing, its glow soft and golden, swaying gently with each of his steps. Rick hadn't asked him to bring it. He hadn't even noticed at first, but Morty held it anyway, because deep down he knew Rick needed light even if Rick would never admit it. For a long while neither of them spoke. Rick's shoulders slumped as though invisible chains dragged at him. Every step seemed slower than the last, every breath heavy. Morty kept glancing at him, the lantern's glow brushing across Rick's face, softening the deep lines of weariness there. "Rick," Morty whispered, his voice breaking the silence without disturbing it. "You don't have to keep carrying everything by yourself." Rick gave a half-snort, half-sigh. "That's the only way I know how, Morty. Been carrying it all so long, it's practically welded to me." Morty shook his head, gripping the lantern tighter. "Then let me carry some of it. Maybe not the big stuff. Maybe not the regret or the memories or the genius that hurts more than it helps. But I can carry light. I can walk beside you, and I can hold this lantern. You don't have to see in the dark alone." The words hung there, soft as a lullaby. Rick stopped walking, staring at Morty as though he had never seen him before. The old man's lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, his gaze drifted to the lantern, to its trembling flame that lit their path in a way no invention of his ever had. "Morty," Rick finally said, his voice rough but quieter than the wind. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what it means to stay beside me." "I do," Morty whispered back. His hand didn't tremble, even though the lantern swayed in the breeze. "I do, Rick. I'm not here because you're invincible or because you're smart or because you can make portals. I'm here because you're you, and even if you can't always see the way forward, I can hold the light until you do." For a man who had faced infinite universes, Rick looked unsteady in that moment, shaken not by science, not by cosmic horrors, but by the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a boy who refused to leave. Rick looked away, his throat tight, eyes glistening. "Morty, I don't deserve—" "Maybe not," Morty cut in gently. "But that doesn't mean you don't need it." The lantern flickered as though agreeing, its glow wrapping around both of them like a fragile shield. And for the first time in what felt like centuries, Rick let someone else guide the way. He didn't try to grab the light. He didn't try to outshine it with one of his machines. He just walked beside Morty, letting himself be led one step at a time. The meadow before them stretched wide, filled with silver grasses that shimmered beneath the lantern's glow. Each blade bent as though bowing to their passage. And Morty thought, maybe this was what it meant to help someone, not to erase the darkness, not to heal all wounds, but simply to carry light long enough for them to breathe again. Rick exhaled slowly, as if setting down something heavy, if only for a moment. "So you're a good kid, Morty," he said, voice low and trembling. "Better than me." "Better than I'll ever be." Morty's reply was simple. "Maybe, but right now we're just walking together." "That's enough." The lantern's flame swayed softly between them, and in its glow, Rick found something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not forgiveness, not freedom, but a fragile kind of peace. And so they walked on, the boy holding the lantern, the man following its light, both of them stitched together by silence, by loyalty, by something gentler than either of them had words for. In the distance, the stars seemed to lean closer, watching quietly, as though the universe itself understood the weight of that little flame. The night was softer than most. The world outside Rick's window seemed wrapped in a hush, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but protective, like the pause between heartbeats. The stars hung steady, glowing faintly through the thin curtains of the garage, while the faint buzz of the machines grew quieter than usual, almost respectful. Rick sat slumped in his old chair, tools scattered carelessly across the workbench. A half-finished device blinked weakly, forgotten. Normally by now there would have been the sharp sound of glass against glass, the clink of another bottle being pulled from the stash at his side. But tonight the bottle stayed closed. His hand lingered near it once, then pulled away. Morty noticed. He had been sitting quietly on the couch in the corner, the lantern from earlier still flickering on the table beside him. Its warm glow stretched across the room, touching Rick's lined face with a gentleness that no invention could replicate. "Rick," Morty said softly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. "You don't have to keep working." "Not tonight." Rick grunted, half an attempt at sarcasm, half just habit. "What else am I supposed to do, Morty? If I stop, everything catches up." Morty leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then let it. Just for one night. Let it catch up and let it pass. You don't always have to outrun everything." Rick tilted his head, eyes heavy. He wanted to argue, he always did, to remind Morty that he wasn't built for rest, that his mind was too loud, too broken, too full of universes he could never fix. But instead the words slipped away, replaced by something he couldn't name, a tiredness deeper than body or mind. He sighed long and low. "Kid, I don't know if I remember how." Morty stood up and walked over, pulling a blanket from the back of the couch. It was old, frayed at the edges, probably forgotten by Beth years ago. He draped it over Rick's shoulders with a quiet care that made Rick flinch, not from discomfort, but from unfamiliarity. "You don't have to remember," Morty whispered. "You just have to try. Close your eyes. Let the night do the rest." Rick stared at him, eyes glassy, lips parting like he might laugh or cry or curse. But then something gave way, something subtle, invisible. He leaned back in the chair, pulling the blanket tighter. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Rick Sanchez closed his eyes without the burn of alcohol on his breath. Morty stayed beside him, sitting back on the couch with the lantern glowing softly between them. He didn't speak again, didn't move. He just listened. And in the silence he heard it. Rick's breathing steadying, slowing, deepening. The sound of a man surrendering not to defeat but to rest. Minutes passed, then hours, though Morty couldn't tell. Time felt different here, folded into the rhythm of sleep. He watched Rick's face soften, the tension around his mouth easing, the furrow in his brow unraveling little by little. It was as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Outside, the stars seemed to shine a little warmer, bending closer to the earth, their light mingling with the glow of the lantern. For once, the cosmos didn't demand answers from Rick Sanchez. It simply let him be. Morty whispered into the quiet, though he knew Rick couldn't hear him. "You're not alone anymore, Rick. You don't have to be." And somewhere in his dreaming, Rick must have heard. For the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips, fragile but real, as he drifted deeper into the night. It was the first time in years that Rick Sanchez slept without the weight of a bottle, without the edge of escape. He slept not because he had solved the universe, but because, for one night, he let himself belong to it. And Morty kept watch, lantern glowing, stars listening, until sleep pulled him under too. The night stretched on, gentle and unbroken. In the quiet of the garage, the only sound was Rick's breathing, steady even, like the rhythm of a tide against the shore. Morty sat curled beneath the soft glow of the lantern, eyelids heavy, but he stayed awake longer than usual. Something about the stillness felt sacred, like interrupting it would shatter glass. Outside the window, the stars glittered with unusual intensity. Morty noticed it when he finally let his gaze wander upward. Normally, stars were distant, sharp pinpricks in the velvet dark. But tonight they seemed to lean in, their light spreading wider, softer, warmer, as though the entire sky had taken a step closer. Morty rubbed his eyes. "Weird," he whispered, though not with fear. It felt less like the universe watching and more like it listening, as if the cosmos itself had bent an ear toward their small corner of existence. Curious about the silence of a man who had always filled it with noise, Rick stirred once, shifting in his chair, the blanket sliding from his shoulder. Morty carefully tucked it back around him, noticing how fragile his grandfather looked when he wasn't surrounded by chaos and invention. Without his lab coat hanging sharp at the edges, without the fire of defiance in his eyes, Rick was just human. For so long, Morty had believed Rick's story was one of endless bravado, of reckless genius carving scars into the universe. But now, in this stillness, Morty realized the louder story was this one, the story of the quiet moments Rick had hidden, the silence he rarely allowed himself to feel. Above them, the stars pulsed faintly as though echoing Rick's breaths. A strange thought entered Morty's mind. What if the universe isn't indifferent? What if it bends just a little toward every whispered confession we never say out loud? And maybe Rick, even in his sleep, was confessing. Not with words, but with rest. A lifetime of running, fighting, drinking, and inventing had built walls too high for anyone to climb. Yet tonight, with his eyes closed, blanket tucked around him, he had let one wall fall. The universe seemed to hear it, seemed to soften in reply. Morty stood and walked toward the open garage door. The night air was cool, brushing his cheeks with the faintest touch of autumn. He looked up fully now, his neck craning, and for the first time he swore he could see the stars moving. Not spinning, not falling, but tilting gently toward him. Toward Rick, toward the fragile human truth of them both. It was beautiful, not loud, not grand, but achingly tender. A hush that stretched across galaxies, a promise that not every secret had to be spoken to be understood. Morty's chest ached, though not with sadness. It was a deep, swelling ache of belonging. He whispered into the night, unsure if the stars could hear or if Rick could dream it. He's trying. For the first time, he's trying to rest. Please, let him have this. And in reply, or maybe only in Morty's heart, the stars seemed to shimmer brighter, scattering silver light across the quiet neighborhood. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of earth, of grass, of something endlessly familiar yet impossibly vast. When Morty turned back to the garage, Rick had not stirred. His breathing was steady, his face softened, as though the stars themselves had cradled him. Morty settled again on the couch, the lantern dimming, his own body finally surrendering to the pull of rest. His last thought before sleep claimed him was simple. Maybe the universe didn't need answers from Rick Sanchez tonight. Maybe it only needed to listen, and it did. All through the night, The universe bent quietly, tenderly, hearing every unspoken word, holding them both in its endless silence. The morning did not announce itself with noise, but with softness. A pale light crept gently across the garage floor, touching Rick's hand where it rested against the arm of the chair. Morty stirred first, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, blinking at the stillness that clung to the air like a secret. For a long moment, he just listened. Rick's steady breaths, the hush of the early breeze outside, the faint creak of the world waking slowly. Rick opened his eyes, not with the usual groan, not with the sharp edge of sarcasm, but as though waking from a dream he didn't want to disturb. He didn't speak, and Morty didn't either. Words felt too heavy for the light that filled the room. Instead, Rick stood and stretched. His lab coat fell open, less a symbol of who he had always been and more like fabric clinging to a man who had simply grown tired. He glanced at Morty and nodded toward the door. No portal guns, no machines, no plans. Just a nod. Morty followed. They walked through the quiet streets, past houses still holding their own dreams. Soon the pavement gave way to fields, and fields gave way to a meadow that stretched wide under the sky. The grass bent in waves beneath the wind, a green ocean rolling softly at their feet. Morty had never seen Rick walk this slowly before. No rush, no frantic energy, no running from or toward anything. Each step seemed deliberate, a rhythm matching the sway of the meadow, the pulse of something older and quieter than all the adventures they had lived. Rick's eyes wandered to the horizon. For once, he wasn't scanning for threats or mapping equations in his head. He was simply watching the way the sun kissed the grass, the way a bird traced its arc through the blue. You know, Morty, he muttered at last, voice rough but calm. I used to think stillness was pointless, waste of time, but... He trailed off, shaking his head, a faint smile breaking at the corner of his mouth. Maybe I was wrong. Morty didn't rush to answer. He only walked closer, their shoulders nearly brushing. Silence between them felt stronger than any words could be. They came to a small stream running through the meadow, the water clear, catching fragments of sky in its surface. Rick crouched down, dipping his hand into the cold current. He stayed there for a long time, as though the water carried something he had lost and was only now remembering. Morty crouched beside him, doing the same. The chill of the stream ran up his arm, but instead of discomfort it felt like a kind of grounding, reminding him he was here, alive, beside someone who was finally letting himself be human. Rick chuckled softly, a sound without mockery. Not everything's about building, Morty. Some things, they're just about being. The words fell like stones into still water rippling through Morty's heart. He nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. I get it, Rick, I really do. They stayed there until the sun climbed higher, painting the meadow in gold. Then they stood side by side and continued their walk. No inventions humming, no portals flashing, no chaos chasing their heels. Just grass brushing against their legs, sky above them, and the sound of their footsteps blending with the earth. For Rick it was not a grand revelation, not a dramatic moment of transformation. It was quieter, smaller, but more powerful, a surrender to the simplicity he had always overlooked. And for Morty, it was a promise that sometimes the greatest journey wasn't across galaxies but across a meadow, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing at all. When they finally stopped, at the crest of a hill, they looked out over the world below. Villages, rivers, forests all stretched beneath them like a quilt, stitched by gentle hands. Rick exhaled, the kind of breath that empties more than lungs. It emptied years. Morty looked at him, saw not the genius or the chaos, but the man who had chosen, at least for today, to walk slowly, to be present. And Morty thought, this is the Rick I'll remember. Not the one who tore through worlds, but the one who walked beside me, here, where the grass whispered and the sky listened. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Their silence was the story. Their silence was the final walk. Evening settled in softly, painting the meadow in violet and amber, as though the day itself was reluctant to leave. Rick and Morty still sat on the hilltop, neither having moved much since they arrived. The world around them seemed to understand their silence, offering only the hush of the breeze, the rustle of grass, and the occasional bird calling out before retreating to its nest. Rick held his knees close, his lab coat loose around his shoulders. His eyes followed the horizon, but his mind lingered elsewhere. It was a rare thing, Morty thought, to see Rick so still, so unguarded. He looked less like the man who had battled through dimensions and more like someone remembering what it felt like to simply exist. At last, Rick spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "Morty, ever think about goodbyes?" The question felt heavy in the air, heavier than Rick's usual words. Morty shifted, glancing at him carefully. "I mean, yes, sometimes. Why?" Rick's lips twisted into a half-smile, not one of humor but of resignation. "I've said too many, Morty, to people, to places, even to versions of myself. I got good at it. Too good." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck as though trying to ease the weight there. "But no matter how many times I walked away, I never really left them. They stick. Every goodbye, it lingers." Morty hugged his arms around himself, staring at the sky where the first stars had begun to shine. He didn't want to imagine saying goodbye to Rick. Not now, not ever. And yet he felt that fear creep into his chest like a shadow. Rick noticed the boy's silence and sighed. "Thing is, Morty, goodbyes are a trick. They make you think something's over. But bonds, real ones, they don't end. They change shape, they fade in and out, but they don't break." His voice softened further, as though confessing something he had never told another soul. "Even when you think you've lost someone, they're still in the air, in the way you laugh, in the way you care. You carry them always." The meadow seemed to lean in closer, the stars blinking gently above them as if in agreement. Morty's chest ached, but it was a tender ache, not sharp. He looked at Rick, whose face in the twilight seemed older, but also gentler, like a man who had fought long enough and was finally ready to let go of the fight. "I don't want to say goodbye to you, Rick," Morty whispered, voice trembling. Rick gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You won't have to, Morty, not really. Someday, sure, I'll be gone in the way bodies go. But me? Who I am to you? That'll still be here. In your stupid questions, in your nervous laugh, in the way you'll remember that I once taught you how to fix a portal gun, or at least how to hold the damn wrench." Morty let out a weak laugh, blinking away the tears that threatened. Rick reached over, resting a rough hand on his shoulder just for a moment. The touch wasn't dramatic, it wasn't long, but it carried more than words ever could. The night deepened and fireflies began to spark in the meadow below, tiny lanterns dancing among the grass. Rick and Morty watched them in silence, both understanding that there was no need for a farewell, not tonight, not ever in the way the world demanded. Rick leaned back, lying against the grass, staring up at the stars. Morty followed, resting beside him. The earth beneath them was cool and steady, holding them both like a cradle. "See those stars, Morty?" Rick murmured, his voice slipping toward drowsiness. "They'll burn out someday. Every one of them. But the light travels. It keeps going even after the star's gone. That's what people are like. You don't say goodbye to light, you just keep looking up." Morty swallowed hard, his small hand curling into the grass. "So, you're saying even if you're not around, you'll still be?" Rick smirked faintly, eyes closed now. "That's the idea, Morty. Annoying, isn't it? Even when I'm not here, you won't get rid of me." Morty chuckled through his tears, a sound fragile but real. He turned his gaze to the sky, watching the endless scatter of stars, and he felt what Rick meant. No goodbye could touch this moment. No ending could take away what they had already shared, and so under the blanket of night, they let the silence answer for them. A silence not of emptiness, but of presence. A silence that promised. There was no goodbye that could undo what they were. The night stretched on, quiet and infinite. Rick and Morty remained on the meadow's slope, the stars weaving their soft patterns above them. But as the hours passed, something shifted. Not in the sky, not in the earth, but within Rick himself. For the first time in so long, his mind was not racing. There were no equations unraveling, no inventions demanding completion, no regrets clawing at him louder than the silence. Just stillness. A stillness he had once feared, avoided, drowned in drink and chaos. Yet here it was, gentle, steady, unthreatening. Morty lay beside him, breathing slow, already drifting between wakefulness and sleep. The boy's presence was like a small anchor, a reminder that not every bond needed noise or action. Sometimes just being there was enough. Rick turned his head slightly, watching Morty's chest rise and fall, and something inside him softened. The silence deepened, folding around them like a blanket. Rick closed his eyes. At first, his old instincts tried to fight it, memories rising, guilt tugging, the itch to move, to do, to fix. But as the moments passed, those instincts weakened. Instead of resisting, he let the stillness wash through him, and in that stillness, Rick discovered something surprising: healing. He remembered nights in the garage, drowning out silence with the hum of machines. He remembered the ache of Beth's absence, the hollow left by friendships broken, the sting of decisions he could never undo. Silence had always been unbearable, because it held all those echoes. But here on this meadow, with Morty beside him and the stars above, silence wasn't punishment. It was peace. Rick inhaled deeply, the air cool and fragrant with grass. His body, weary in ways he rarely admitted, began to ease. The tension in his shoulders loosened, the ache in his chest lightened. He realized then that silence wasn't empty. It was full of presence, of space, of gentle acceptance. Morty stirred slightly, mumbling in his half-sleep. "Rick, you okay?" Rick smiled faintly, eyes still closed. "Yeah, Morty, for once, yeah, I am." The boy drifted off again, trusting Rick's words, and Rick felt a strange swell of gratitude. He had always believed strength came from movement, from brilliance, from never stopping. But now he understood. Sometimes the greatest strength was in letting yourself stop, in letting the silence hold you without fear. He let his breathing match Morty's, slow and steady. The stars above shimmered softly, and for a fleeting moment Rick imagined they were listening. The universe itself leaning down, not in judgment but in quiet witness. It was as though the cosmos whispered back to him, "It's enough, Rick, you've done enough. Rest now." Tears pricked at his eyes, not the wild drunken kind, but gentle ones, the kind that fall when a burden finally begins to lift. He didn't wipe them away. He simply let them be. The meadow stretched endlessly, but within it Rick felt small in a way that wasn't crushing. Small but cared for, small but part of something vast and kind. The silence cradled him, and for the first time in countless years Rick allowed himself to surrender fully to it. He whispered softly, not to Morty, not even to himself, but to the night. I think I'm okay with this. No invention could replicate this feeling. No machine could build it. No portal could carry him to it. It had always been here, waiting for him to be ready, for him to be still enough to notice. Rick shifted slightly in the grass, his body relaxing further. He felt heavy, but in the best way, like the earth was finally holding him instead of the other way around. His thoughts slowed, drifting like clouds instead of storms. The silence was not empty. It was alive, and in it Rick was healing. And so, beneath the stars, with Morty sleeping beside him, and the world quiet at last, Rick let himself rest. Not just his body, not just his eyes, but his heart. He didn't need to chase the silence away anymore. It was not his enemy. It was his cure. Morning did not come with alarms or urgency. It arrived slowly, like a shy guest stepping softly into the meadow. A pale light stretched across the horizon, brushing the grass with silver, touching the sleeping boy's face and laying gently across Rick's closed eyes. Morty stirred first. He blinked, the fog of dreams still clinging to him, and turned his head toward Rick. His grandfather lay still, his breathing even, his features softer than Morty could remember. There was no drink in his hand, no tools scattered at his side. Just Rick, quiet and human, resting beneath the waking sky. For a long time, Morty didn't move. He simply watched. He thought of how many nights he had seen Rick pacing, muttering equations, drowning his thoughts in glass bottles. He thought of how many times Rick's brilliance had shielded them, and how many times his pain had nearly broken them. But this was different. Here was Rick without armor, without the noise, without the chaos. Just a man. And in that sight, Morty understood something he hadn't before. His grandfather was not invincible. He was fragile, carrying too much, yet still finding ways to move forward. Morty felt a quiet ache, but not of despair. It was love. A love that saw the cracks and did not turn away. He whispered softly, as if not to disturb the silence Rick had finally embraced. It's okay. Rick, you don't always have to carry it alone. Rick didn't stir. He was lost in rest, deeper than usual, as if the universe itself had given him permission to let go. Morty sat up, drawing his knees to his chest, watching the morning spread wider. Birds in this strange meadow began to sing, not loud, not sharp, but soft, like a lullaby woven into the dawn. Morty closed his eyes and listened, letting the melody sink in, and in that quiet, Morty made a vow. He promised that he would carry forward the lessons Rick had given him, not the reckless ones, not the dangerous inventions or chaotic escapes, but the quieter lessons. The way Rick had laughed, even when sorrow lingered beneath it. The way he had shown care without naming it, in the smallest, most hidden gestures. The way he had let Morty see that brilliance was nothing without heart. Morty thought of the night before, of the silence that had healed Rick. That silence had healed something in him too. He realized then that he didn't need to become Rick, or live in Rick's shadow. He just needed to carry the best of him, the loyalty, the strange tenderness, the resilience. He whispered again, firmer this time, "I'll remember, Rick. I'll carry it with me. I promise." The promise wasn't about saving worlds or building machines. It wasn't about proving himself or being strong in ways Rick had been. It was simpler. Morty promised to be present, to love quietly, to hold close what Rick had finally allowed himself to show, that even the loudest lives need gentleness, even the brightest minds need rest. The sun climbed a little higher, brushing gold into the sky. Rick stirred faintly then, opening one eye halfway, catching Morty's gaze. "What are you staring at, Morty?" Rick's voice was rough but not unkind. Morty smiled a little, his words steady. "Just making a promise." Rick frowned, curious but too tired to press. He let his eyes fall closed again. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Morty." Morty's voice was soft but sure. "This one, I can keep." Rick didn't respond, already drifting back into that rare healing rest. But Morty didn't need him to. The vow was made, silent and true, carried not in words but in the rhythm of his heart. The meadow seemed to listen. The breeze shifted gently, the grass swaying as if bowing to the boy's promise. The universe, vast and endless, had heard too, and perhaps in its quiet way it approved. Morty lay back down beside his grandfather, closing his eyes once more. The promise lingered inside him, warm and steady, a lantern he would carry long after the meadow was gone. For now, though, he let himself drift. Morning's light softened, the bird-song hushed and sleep returned. Gentle, easy, filled with dreams not of fear, but of love carried forward. The meadow faded long before Morty opened his eyes again. When he woke, the world had shifted. The grass was thinner, the sky stretched wider, and the colors felt like a dream half-remembered. Rick was standing this time, his back to Morty, looking out at the horizon. He wasn't tinkering, wasn't rushing, wasn't hiding behind a flask or a machine. He was simply standing, hands folded behind him, shoulders lower than usual, his wild hair touched softly by the light of a setting sun. Morty blinked, rubbing his eyes, and whispered, "Rick." Rick turned halfway, his expression unreadable, then softened into something rare, a small, almost imperceptible smile. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They walked together, side by side, through the field that seemed to stretch forever. No portals opened. No machines beeped. No threats chased them. Just two figures moving quietly through a place that asked for nothing but presence. The silence was not heavy this time. It was gentle, carrying with it the weight of everything unsaid but understood. Each step seemed to echo across time, across every version of Rick and Morty that had ever existed. Morty felt it. This was not about endings. It was about folding a story into something softer, something that could rest. Rick stopped near a low hill where the grass swayed like ocean tides. He sat down heavily, motioning for Morty to join him. Morty did, settling into the earth, both of them gazing up at a sky littered with stars. For a while, neither spoke. The stars seemed closer here, bending gently, as if listening, as if waiting. Finally, Rick exhaled, a sound almost like relief. "You know, Morty, not everything needs fixing. Not everything needs explaining." His words trailed off, but their weight lingered. Morty nodded. He didn't reply with words, only leaned a little closer, letting his shoulder brush Rick's. It was enough. The stars shimmered above them, reflecting in Rick's tired eyes. Somewhere in their glow was every moment he had run from, every choice he regretted, every fragment of joy he had hidden away. But tonight he let them be. He didn't chase them. He didn't curse them. He simply let them exist. The quiet grew deeper, stretching long enough that Morty thought Rick might have fallen asleep again. But then Rick spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "When I'm gone, Morty, don't remember the mess. Remember the quiet. Remember this." Morty's throat tightened, but he answered softly, "I will, Rick, I promise." Rick gave a faint nod, closing his eyes as if that was all he needed to hear. The universe tilted then, not in chaos but in kindness. The stars seemed to fold inward, wrapping Rick's story into their light. He didn't vanish. He didn't end. He simply became part of something larger, something eternal. Morty sat very still, the promise warm inside him. He realized then that Rick's story was not about brilliance or inventions or mistakes. It was about being human in a universe too big to ever fully hold. It was about trying, failing, loving in strange and hidden ways, and finding at the very end a place of peace. The stars kept listening. The field kept swaying. And somewhere, in a way beyond time, beyond Morty's reach but never beyond his heart, Rick still waited. Not gone, not lost. Simply resting in the quiet he had finally found. Morty lay back in the grass, eyes heavy, breath slow. He didn't need to say goodbye. He understood now. Bonds like theirs didn't break. They stretched, they shifted, they carried forward. His eyes drifted shut. The last thing he felt was the warmth of the stars above him, holding both of their stories like a lullaby. And with that, Rick's tale folded gently into silence. Not a conclusion, but a soft exhale. Not an ending, but a resting place. Somewhere he is still out there, waiting, watching, perhaps even napping beneath the stars. And with that, Rick let the silence hold him. Somewhere he is still out there, napping beneath the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.